So now, next up we've got Bart, who's going to walk through localizing an Angular JS app. So you've seen the kind of problems, solutions, kind of overview, and now more, I guess you could say more intermediate to advanced thing. So hand it over to you, Bart.
Cool, thanks. Well, first of all, thank you everybody for coming. This is very good to see this nice JavaScript community growing in Hong Kong. There have been many meetups already before, but every time it was quite small. I'd love to see so many more people here, so that's very cool. So I'm going to talk about localizing an Angular JS app because I had to do it quite recently for my job. I work at QuantiFeed, which is a financial technology startup, and we build an Angular JS based web application. So I'm telling you the technical side of it. This is what we do. You go and also see the app later in action, but mainly I want to tell you about what it meant to internationalize this app. And what we got into. There's some nice lessons learned that we have, and I think you might like it as well. So first of all, what is this, right? I'm not going to repeat that word 1,000 times. I'll use I18N. It's a little bit faster. And localization. Actually, we tend to use localization. It's easy to pronounce, easy to grasp. But the difference is that you will see a lot of I18N because that's basically the technological term to say, okay, we're going to make our app in an international way. So if you start your app out from scratch, usually there is no internationalization features, right? But by adding a library or some additional functionality, you can actually turn the application into something that accepts multiple languages. But not only languages, you also have cultural things, maybe different calendars, things like that. And that is more localization. So turning an app into a certain locale. So for instance, English, Chinese, and so forth. Globalization term also sometimes used, but it's really more in corporations when they want to release their applications to multiple countries and all that comes together with it. Think of Apple, for instance, they need to release in many countries. They have different rules to abide and all those kind of things. I won't be talking about that, thank goodness, because I don't know anything about it. But I will be talking about the first two. And so the talk is segmented in two parts. So there will be a nice demo in between. So first up, internationalization. So one thing that you maybe immediately recognize when you do this is the language code, right? That's very recognizable if you go to a web application and you see the codes, usually EN US for me. But you may also know about some others, especially for here in Hong Kong. We know we have to usually support 2 languages. Who actually has built an application before and had to localize it? Okay, quite a few, about 10 people. Was it fun? Actually, to be honest, I quite enjoyed doing this. It was easier than I thought, but it's always definitely challenging, that I can tell. Not easy. One thing which I found a very good read while doing some research was this article from the W3. They nicely introduce you to a lot of the most important core concepts of it, and have a nice introduction, and especially what that means as a web application, right? So what do you need to think about on your HTML side, your server side, your client side, scripting side. So one thing back about the languages, the language codes, note there is some different parts to it, right? So what is really a language? Language is what we know we speak, right? For instance, Chinese. But think of Chinese in Hong Kong, right? In Hong Kong we have the script, for instance, traditional Chinese. And you can see here we use Han Ti, and that means for the traditional side. We also have the simplified below. And of course the locale, so where is it actually used? You can use Chinese in different countries, right? Several countries have it as their language. So this means where it's actually used. And this combination is how you usually identify a application and get it into a certain locale. So you have seen, I think, maybe thousands of language selectors. But one thing that you really need to get right is don't use flags. Especially for the Germans and I think of the Swiss, the Belgians. In Belgium you speak 2 languages, right? Dutch, where I'm from, Holland, and also French. So they may have an identity crisis if you use flags. Don't do that. Another thing is if you list out the thing, what could you do instead? Maybe you can list already the language that you're visiting in, right? So if you're already in English, you show the name in English. But if you're, for instance, Chinese, you still show the languages in Chinese. So for a native speaker, it's easy to select. There are some smarts, of course, that you can do to detect this. And I would recommend that previous link where there are some techniques that they describe on how to detect the language. But you can think of cookies. There's also some HTTP headers. And I won't go too much into detail there, but you can find it out there. It depends on your application how you can implement it. But one talk I really quite liked and I can recommend, it's about an hour, is from Gunnar, and he really touches very well on these things and things you need to think of. Really recommend this talk.
One question, what would you recommend? My personal experience as a user, since I live in Asia, is that I go to websites, it's all in Chinese, and it's all in Chinese.
Right.
And what could you recommend for user experience to, I also had this experience, but in Latin languages like Dutch, you can at least find something hinting you. What would you provide as a solution to the users?
Well, one thing to repeat the question was what would I use as a pattern to show which languages to use, right?
And how to switch, like...
and to switch, right? It depends a little bit on who you target. So, for instance, here in Hong Kong, you likely have only English and the Chinese, right? So you have the simplified and the traditional scripting. Maybe if you target some other people in Hong Kong, you may support maybe some other languages as well. But this should be your first drive because that makes it so much easier. You don't need to support everything, right? It's also going to be quite troublesome to do it. So you first have that. So, for instance, in Hong Kong, you will see you usually have English. And everybody knows, look for the English thing, right? Some others use the globe icon, which is very recognizable, and then the drop-down where you then show the list of languages which you can select to make it fairly easy. That's actually the one that we went also for in our application. Cool. Next up is also some server-side support. So I know JavaScript, we're client-side. But when we were implementing this, we actually found that we had some parts where we really needed to get the server support right. Especially because we have a front-end application and we talk to a back-end server. And so we asked from the back-end API some information. And of course, we wanted that to be in the right language as well. So the key element here is the accept language. And so we were very happy. We were starting to build this on our machines, and we were able to send the accept language. We had a handler on the server side to pick that up, choose the right data from the database, bring it back up. It was all very fun and happy, and we got very close to actually release date, and we ship it out to somebody else, and somebody else tries it out and they go like, yeah, no, it's not working. I just still get English, you know, even though it's like a different language. I'm like, that's weird, you know, we get it right. So trying and like, yeah, server side, all the API calls, everything goes right. Yes, we sent the right code back as well in the response. There's another header that you may need to supply. And I think, what's going on, right? Turns out, if you start searching a little bit and you find all these people who have been through this pain, is that the accept language by most servers by default is not identified as a different caching mechanism. So if you have requested a resource before, maybe your default language, let's say English, and then the second time you want to request it, the request is actually never going to hit the server because your browser thinks, oh, well, I have this one already here, let's just pull it from the cache. So this is where the very HTTP header comes in. You really need to have that, especially for a REST API, right? Because on a REST API, the URL doesn't change. Usually that would be something that could trigger it. So some people have never hit this issue because they use in their URL a different language. But if you don't do it, if you keep your URLs clean and just only use the accept language header, use this one. Make sure that your server backend supports this. The other part that was a bit tricky to get right, and I don't know what's the holy grail, we took something that we felt is natural, and especially on the URL routing, right? How do you do it? We actually looked at the major companies that have international websites and how they did, and yes, they use the ugly language tag in front of the first URL. The reason why we mainly went for this approach as well is that once you send the URL around, you get at least the right language back, right? So if I'm visiting the website in English and I send it to somebody and I expect it to also show English, right? If it would be automatic selection, yes, it maybe could work, but then maybe you get again the issue of not showing the right language. If it is even more localized, so let's say, for instance, for Hong Kong, right, English Hong Kong, and I send just a general link and it sends me to whatever Asia Pacific in general, then I may not find the right thing. So that's why we went for the tag in the URL. Without any specification of a language, we just pick English because that's our leading language for our case in our application. But it could be very well different for your application, right? If you maybe target here, local Hong Kong could be Cantonese. Yes.
I personally found another advantage doing that is for Google crawling.
Good point. Yeah. Yeah.
Because it would penalize you if you just put one URL. For all languages, it would think you duplicate the content.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Good point. We got also on the CEO side of things, right? So if you have particular content on that page, you want them to visit that content. Yeah. Thanks. Good tip. The resource files, that's another part, right? So if you have your website and you have it in many languages, you're not going to ship that to everybody in one go and let, for instance, the client-side applications pick it, right? So in some frameworks, and we will see some later, some do this dynamically. We went actually for that, since we already know on the server which language that you want to have, why not already ship that language as a resource file with the request that we send back? So because we use AngularJS, we send back a JSON file with the package, with the application package. So it's very quick to bootstrap the application that way. Also, it can do the caching already automatically. We don't need to wait for AngularJS to load all the way, bootstrap, and then go like, oh yeah, what language do you want, right? So that is a nice, fast way to detect it, we found. But maybe for you, if you really have just a client-side app and you don't have a server backend, that may not be the right thing, right? So I'm just explaining what we found the most useful for ourselves. Then what things do you need to think about when you start doing internationalization, right? When you want to have multiple languages or other sorts of things for a special locale in your application. One thing that I found the most troubling at first, especially with AngularJS, was to embed HTML, and whether it's actually text, just plain text, or HTML. Also, think of it when you send it to your translator. They need to know also the HTML. In Angular, we're very used to be able to put all these nice tags in there, directives, whatnot, right, to really make a very responsive application. But once you go to internationalize your app, you go like, oh, okay, now I need to find all the text parts, and it becomes very solid. You really look for the placeholders and try to piece it in there. And then suddenly some application constructs become quite tricky, because should that be part of the translation? Should the translator put this component in, or should the application render, for instance, a certain component on a condition? So that was one thing where we found, okay, I still haven't found the holy grail in that sense. I try to do as much as plain text as possible because that's easier to implement. But there are some parts where we still need to have HTML. For instance, a help text. Think of that. A help dialog pops up. You want to have maybe a bullet list or some images or stuff like that, and that we found, that should be possible for the translator to understand. Pluralization and gender. These are very tricky things, and we see that later when we talk about how to do it. Calendars, in Thailand they have a different year, so people have different ages. You need to be aware of that. This is really the localization part of things, right? How is that applicable to a certain place in the world where you're actually using your application, right? It may not be applicable in Hong Kong at all, right? So this is where you start to think about, okay, what do we really need? So you don't necessarily need to do everything. Also for the dates, numbers, and currencies, for instance, we at this moment choose to have a default format because it works for our UI. We have a lot of information, a lot of little data pieces. If we would suddenly change to, for instance, a Dutch or French, we have very long month names, or maybe shorter. Maybe we use one letter for the day notation, maybe 3, 4. We just wanted to go for something that we can easily support, so we have some choices there. But you can support others, but it becomes more tricky as you need to have also the libraries to do this, right? Because normally you would just use a format string, but in different languages you have different orders, right? Even with dates, number formats, digits. Currencies, especially because we have a financial application, we just use the currency codes because this is the easiest for us now. We could still decide later to translate as well, because in our case it's a string that comes back from the database. So whatever that string is just meaningful for the end user. Another nice thing is fonts and text sizes. So our translators actually provided us with a list of recommended fonts that we should use. There's a couple that you really want to use, and of course it still needs to match with your website, right? But do think about, for instance, Chinese, some scripts you cannot make it too small, right? So in your design you need to think about it should actually be wide enough, and especially in some languages, as I think it was Swedish. Swedish is the longest language in the world, so that's, I believe, why Microsoft starts first out to do that in Windows, to make sure all the text fits in the dialogues. But I have a nice trick for that later, which we used and was very useful. And there's many more stuff, but this is the things that I hit and found useful. Yes.
In some language, the sequence is from right from left to left.
Yes.
So how do you handle this? For example, the Hebrews and
I'm happy I don't need to. That will be very tricky, yes.
Did you have to provide the context for the translators, like a screenshot or something like that?
Good point. I will get to that a little bit later when we talk about the API. But yeah, that's a very good point.
I guess, sorry, the data in your database is also in multiple languages?
Yes, indeed. Yeah. So in our case, for our application, as you may have seen in the beginning, we show a portfolio, so trends, groups, easy information for people to invest in, and we have per language a description, for instance, on what you're going to invest in, right? So we want to make sure that that is in very clear language. We'll talk about that a little bit later too. So a couple of the JavaScript libraries. I have not spent an awful lot of time in looking at many libraries because we have already a set. We didn't want to change much in our application. So we happen to use Sugar. Sugar provides nice things for strings, formatting, dates, arrays. It's actually quite a nice library. We like it quite a lot. And there's also built-in support for multiple languages. Quite smart ways as well to do it. So in code, it looks very clean and neat. So I recommend you to look at it. There's also Moment.js for time, but that's just time. But they do have internationalization as well. AngularJS itself, they do not have much at the moment. It's very basic. The loading system is pretty crappy actually. But good thing to know is that they're working on this in 1.4. And actually there will be a bit more on that also later. One that I found through my research before I did this talk was this I18N ext or next. That seemed to be actually also quite nice. They used some of the methods that I found that are quite common to do, because when I went for the localization myself, I used my own API, but if I find a better one, of course I will replace it. But I hit a couple of issues implementing my own API, and you can see that in that project I really thought about this and found these things. So I think that's a good resource to look at. Okay, what do you want as boundaries? What should you support in your application? Angular specific, so you have the routing, as I said before, but there is server-side and client-side, right? So server-side, as I said, in our case, we actually already look at the ID that we have. So the bootstrap package that we sent with Angular already includes the language resource. If you don't, you still need to check this client-side. We still do this as well. Because we need to know which language that you have and put it in the selector to make sure that we show, okay, this is the language that you have picked. And that is a bit of a tricky one. Because if you know AngularJS, there is the URL routes that you can do. And you can put arguments in a route. But if the argument is the very first one, that's not a design that they really, anticipated for, I guess, in the beginning. Because if you have a thing that matches anything in first, that will match everything, right? So therefore, when we get the route in, I first need to check, is this a route with a language? So that's why I need to get a list of which languages that we have. See if it matches one that has a language. If so, strip off the language part and then move on to the next condition where it just does the normal way, right? So we strip it off and then move on to the next one. It's a bit of a tricky thing, especially because I think only in the latest version of Angular they support to use the optional question mark behind your argument. So that is a bit of a technical detail, but definitely a very important one to do right, because otherwise it just won't bootstrap, right? You just get the wrong URL whenever you, or the wrong screen whenever you send it around, or it won't even load at all. Another a tricky one, and who has actually programmed in AngularJS before? All right, about half. Who knows about this one? The SCE. Who hit that issue before? Only 2. Okay, 3. This is a nasty one, especially in AngularJS. They do it for a very good reason, though. Because what this thing does is it says basically in the Angular scope that we trust this HTML. So it actually says that, okay, if you put anything in there that is a cross-site scripting attack, then sorry, you said it was trustable, so that's your own mistake. But for the rest, they try really their best to make sure that anything that you return is not going to be rendered, which is kind of a problem if you expect it to do, right? So if you have a directive, which means an HTML tag with some Angular or JavaScript sugar on top of it to parse it out, and you put some HTML in it, you just think, okay, I want to have some argument that I want to pass to my component that's going to render. That may not render because it just expects text by default. If you know that if one of the first things that you do when you get started with Angular, even on the demo page, when you look at it, you see the hello world example, and the way you do it was with 2 curly braces, put there a variable in. Well, that variable by default cannot easily support HTML, not as in rendered, right? It will escape it for you to make sure that it's not rendering some random script on the side and start it. In order to get it to work, it's actually using underneath this through a, the bind HTML directive. So you need to use an attribute, for instance on a span or something, and then say pass in a variable. That variable needs to be wrapped in this thing. So when you return from it, it returns an object that does this. Now, the tricky bit in this is that let's say you are in your application code, in your controller, which is the part that renders or sets up the component, and you want to send something back to the view. Then it depends whether that view has used the curly braces or the bind as HTML, whether that's going to work. Right? If you use the bind HTML, that's going to work almost all the time. However, it's really not common to do that, right? Because it's not very convenient. So this is a tricky one, and that's what I meant before. Which content do you want to use? Do you want to use HTML or do you want to use plain text? And that's why I used as much as possible plain text in my AngularJS app, because then I can just use the standard bindings. Or, in other words, I don't need to rewrite the entire app to make it working. Then another thing is, in order to call the API that I designed to do the translations, I needed to get quick access to it, and that meant using the root scope, which is a little bit of a taboo in Angular, but I found it to be working quite well. We will see later why I chose actually this kind of API design. The last thing is that in your code, you may need to do these calls as well. Not only in your templates, but also in your code, because your code may return some warning messages or something like that back as well. So you need to have some sort of API that you also can call there that also does for you the translation. And you already start to see that all these language translation things are starting to pop all over the place. So let's have a look at what actually is out there. What can you use nowadays? So just not so long ago, I think it's 2 weeks ago, there was a new blog post called Planning Angular 1.4, and in there you find a link to a design document by, I'm not sure, yeah, I didn't mention it here, but in the post you can find who's working on that. There's one person in Google who's taking the lead and doing this design, and from what I've seen on his background, he's done this before in other Google projects. So also, if you look at the design doc, very well documented. There's a lot of things in there. I wish I had seen it before I started to do it, before I released it, but yeah, anyhow, it's good to know that some parts I did right, some parts I didn't, but it's definitely a very good one to look at. And so they're still working on it because there's, as I said before, there's only very basic support. In the meantime, there has been Angular Translate, which is a module, and they provide a way to do it. And I will go through all these 4 methods in a bit. There's also the Closure translation, which comes, of course, out of Google, and which they, I think, use mostly for their own products as well. You can see it's quite solid, but it's really an internal Google project. Then there's the 1.4 proposal and the method that I chose to use myself. Angular Translate, so the thing is that if you input all this stuff into your application, you need to find it, right? because you need to eventually pass it on to the translator. And that comes back also to your question, like, does it have context, right? Can we tell the translator, oh yeah, this is text that goes onto a button, and it's not something that is just random somewhere on the page. So they need to parse your whole application to find all these strings to make one resource and send that back, for instance, to the translator. That's unfortunately something that is hard to do. Because you can imagine it may break, right? If you have a HTML file, needs to parse it, whatever it expected, yeah, that will work. But if it ever changes, you become very dependent on this tool for it to work. It can really quickly break, I think. Also, there is poor performance in this approach because they use the bindings, the Angular bindings, which means there's more watches. And if you get deeper into Angular, you know that more watches means uh-oh. Because then your whole application can come to a grinding halt. And especially if you think that for every little piece of text that you have on your page, that will be an extra binding. If you go, I think about over 300 or something like that, then you will start to notice the binding performance. So you will see that the application becomes more sluggish. In some cases, it can completely crash. So that is a negative side of things. The good things though is that you can also use it nicely inline, like you do with AngularJS. So like you can use your own tags into your HTML. They also have a nice way to have the same directives to actually have it nicely in line with your template. How it works on the API side of things, I couldn't find much about it, so I wonder if they actually even have this part. Then another nice thing, depending on your application, this works purely client-side, right? So no server-side support. The language selection, if you pick a different language, it will completely reload your application automatically. It does this dynamically. We went actually for something that it will completely reload the page. And those two approaches you actually see also in the design document that now currently the Angular team is working on. Now they're quite big differences, right? So whichever they choose may not fit for your approach, especially if it's dependent on the server, because I think there's a lot of Angular apps out there that just depend on the client-side thing. So the other thing that is used apparently internally in Google for several projects is the Clojure translation. So they use the Clojure tool to compile, because Clojure is a pre-compiler, so you have a different language and it compiles it into something else. And because they do that, they can do some more nice tricks. However, it does require that pre-compilation step. So all your code needs to be parsed again. If you are internal Google, you can predict what's going to be in there, or you can say, you cannot do that. But if you have the public domain, yeah, this may not be a right approach. So I don't think they will actually go for this, even though they use this already in their internal thing, especially because they said their tools were not so good. Don't quote me on that, okay? The nice thing though is, and I really look for this as well, but it's very hard to do, there is of course a very, very, very tiny performance impact. Because what you ship is just different versions of your application, right? It's like a different book that's pre-translated. You just give it out, and you can do it very fast, right? We just normal standard web page. Nothing on rendering, no degradation of performance if you do more translation. It's just an entire different application in a way. So that's quite nice. I really like that approach though. If we could do that together with the previous one, picobello, but not yet there. So they're looking there. They came up with a proposal, which is very close to the Angular Translate project, which means they do it inside, but they use a little bit of a different syntax. And there are some standard approaches that you can use to define, for instance, gender, or if it's plural or not. And this requires a certain syntax. But I think when you see it, you go like, that doesn't look anymore like very nice, clean Angular. Well, that's something that you have to actually bite for when you go for localization in your application anyway, because it's going to change. It's not going to look like a standard run-of-the-mill Angular app anymore. So they really do their best to make it look better, but it still requires that tooling to go into your code, parse it. Hopefully nothing changes, and Google, never changes their APIs, right? As we know. So be careful with that, right? I'm not so sure if this is like digging yourself a little hole that you're in you can never get out of. The nice thing though, again, is that they use the Angular way of defining it, so that's quite nice. The approach I went for myself is a little bit based on what I've seen before in other translation applications, also in other projects like in WordPress. It's more the Unix way of called PO files. So you have a little call where you tell the application, I want this text to be there. And what that means though is that because you make every time this call, this will still be a poor performance, right? So I also use the binding approach to put all these bindings in there. For our application, we luckily don't have so much text. We have more numbers and graphs. So for us, it's actually okay. I don't really see a massive performance degradation in our case, but if it would grow over time, yeah, I may not use this approach for everything. I would like to have that pre-compilation if possible. This approach requires browser automation, and we're going to see that in a bit what that means, but I also think you will like it. Because if you build an application that needs to be solid, if it's not just something that you quickly need to get out, you really want to be able to test your application. And I found that once I already do a little bit of browser automation, I found a lot of problems easily to be detected, right? If you make a breaking change and the web application completely doesn't load anymore, it will easily detect that. Especially if you work with different environments, maybe development, test, and production like we have, then it's very nice if you have this safety net. It does also require on the server side to pick already the language. I went through that approach because it is a bit more performant then. You don't have that dynamic loading penalty, which the Angular Translate has. But you need to support it on the server, so that's one thing. What I did want to have was that readable API. And I'm going to show you some code samples in a bit, and you see it for yourself that it's quite readable. With also a fallback. So when you start localizing your application, you practically already have your application, right? The text is right there. But what you see with a lot of these APIs is that they say, oh, use this cryptic string, and then let's guess what that actually would be, right? Buy button display text. Would that be just buy? Or would it say, buy this right now, and it's very long, so your whole design will be stretched? You cannot anticipate it. So if you design your app, you will be struggling with what is actually coming back from it and how it's going to look like. So I wanted that. And I also wanted to have that contextual information like you mentioned before, right? Because if you send it over, actually we had this case. We have an order page where you place an order to do a trade. But our translator got the word order, and so they translated into Chinese to making like a military order. I order you to do this. So that was not right? And if we would just have provided a little bit of context, that would have just been very easy, right? So also if you have jargon and things like that, that will be very, very, very useful, which almost everybody has, right? It's also fairly easy to maintain because it's really just your code. It's right in there. There's no other things. You can just use that. And because it looks the same, almost the same as what normal text is, you can do it as you go. And I'll show you a little bit later what that means as well. To do that, I use Protractor, which is a very cool tool, as you will see in a bit. And Protractor, you can just find it online. It's right here. And it's a combination of several projects together. Selenium, you may already have heard about this before. So Selenium is a Java application that can drive a browser. So your Google, your IE, and it literally tells click there, browse here, take a screenshot, move to this page, navigate to that URL. Very cool, especially when you see it in action in a bit. WebDriver is their API on top of that to do these things. There's a JavaScript API for it. And Protractor is an API which there have been several versions of it, but I see this one is pretty stabilized now. Very easy to use, very readable, so you still have nice little unit tests or the test scripts to build it, and it has the smarts of Angular. So you can say pick this thing with this Angular binding instead of go to element this, navigate to this table, find this particular thing, and then click the button inside. So it's very easy to use. You can also use CSS selectors in that. So let's see it in action, I think. Okay, let's see. So we use a Microsoft stack in our company. So we run everything on Azure. We use also Visual Studio. So I will show you this here. And let me first run the application. So the testing component. So in order to do that, I need to start the Protractor first, and before that I need to have Selenium to actually be able to drive a browser. So I do the web driver manager. Sorry if it's very small, I will say it out loud. So web driver manager start, which starts up this application. Okay. Then the other thing is I just run Protractor. Oh, sorry, one moment. I need to do something else. Yeah, I'm in the test project. So from the test project where my tests have been defined, I run Protractor, which will find this configuration file which I made before, where it just picks up all these JavaScript files, which uses Mocha as a testing framework in this case, and just runs normal tests. So let's run this, and I need to move a little bit quick. Okay, there it goes. So it opens up a browser, incognito, that was nice, and it starts running through the tests. And it will do step by step the test. And as you can see, we're now logging into Trend Investor. We do a few tests to make sure, see if the actually login works. I do checks whether the username and password works, like very difficult in unit tests, right? You need to do an integration test. So it brings up Trend Investor. I hope it will work. If it's not fast enough, it will, yeah, we have a bit of a warm-up time at the moment. This is our development environment, so therefore it's not as fast as our production environment. So we'll navigate through all the pages. And there's a reason for me to do this. Because whenever it touches a page, all the translation calls get called. And when it does this call, I thought, like, you know what, if it runs these calls, let me try to see if it actually gets to completely green. So I'll run it again. If these translation calls get called, why can I not just capture that? And when I capture it, why don't I just store it in a file? And that file, if I do it smart with a little converter, I can send to the translator. And they translate it, they send me the file back, I just import it back in, and whenever something gets called, it will use an ID, and it will pick it up and automatically display it. So the only thing I need to do as in translation is in all my codes, yep, it's luckily passing finally. Let me see if I can make that bigger for you. So just so you believe me, it's passing. Okay. So what does that code look like, right? Maybe I show you quickly a little bit the test. So I will make it a little bit bigger. This is one of these tests, and that's just for, in our case, to load the home page. Is it big enough for everybody? Can everybody read? Yeah. So we have here one of the stages. You saw that it makes a nice hierarchy. You can have several test runners to do this. There's plenty out there. We say we want to do this thing, and then I say in this, in this, I want to get an element, and I get the element by a CSS query. So I just find the shell, I ask for that, and I click on the button with the home link, which has nothing in it, right? So it's an empty one, it's the root URL, and say click that one, go to home. Then, and this is the thing that you need to understand with what Protractor does for you, you need to tell, oh, wait, stop. We're going to wait for a certain condition to appear on the web page because it's slow, maybe it needs to load, so we wait for that to actually pop up, right? So we say, okay, wait until you see that this home view ID, which is, of course, the view, is present, right? Very readable, very easy to do. We give it 3 seconds to do that. So that was the reason why the first time it failed, because I didn't give it enough time, because I still want to do this in development mode quite often, right? And then short is enough for me. I can just warm it up myself, and then once it is warmed up, I just run this many times, right? Just to see if everything works. So if it doesn't work within 3 seconds, then I get this error message and exactly where, okay, this is the thing that didn't work. So it's a message for myself to see this is where you need to look at, right? In the application, this little thing didn't work. So imagine your application tests become huge, right? Ideally. Then this will be very handy to have around there. So we wait for this condition, but sometimes it didn't work, right? Just like you saw before. So we need to then do an assertion to actually check for this step to pass to see whether this is actually the case. So in this case, for my logic that I know from the application, I say, okay, if the title shows home, that means everything is okay, because I only show this thing in my controller at the point that we get to that step. To be entirely sure, I also say, is there in, and this is quite a nice call, I really like this one. Is there in CSS, in this element, so I tried to find the header one, is there in this thing the text home? You can also do this with a larger thing, so there may be a hierarchy or some random stuff. So if you just have some key things that you know as the application developer, like this, if this is there, it's working, right? Then it's fine. Then this will be the trigger for me to say, okay, we're now at this stage in the application. It's good to go to the next thing. And the next thing in this case would be, for instance, to check, is the account summary heading showing on the home page, right? So we show how much money that you have in your account. And so forth, right? These are the tests that you write. But as you can see, they're quite readable if you know your application code. And the flow is quite nice. There is some black magic happening in the background to actually make this work so easily, to have just these very readable parts, and that you can all find on the Protractor website. But it's what makes that Protractor quite cool and quite nice. Okay, so this is running these tests, and I can spend maybe another talk on this sometime. But what I want to show you is the actual API calls. So let me try to find one. Let's go to, we have to get used to that. I'm now with the Mac key binding, sorry for that. Is my control command, yes, home HTML. So I jump to my home. And in here, because I was doing the translation and I didn't have yet the perfect way to capture all text in some cases, so I put some placeholder text here. These are the calls that I meant where I talk to the root scope. Because when I boot up the application, I assign somewhere where I have a convenience method that I can call from anywhere in my HTML, which means the root scope, a API. So I assign these functions that you can call in there. And I do, as you can see, this syntax, who maybe for the Angular experts out there, what is this one? It's new.
Bind once.
Bind once, exactly. So this is where we said before the performance can be pretty bad, because Angular keeps checking if something is there. You can tell here, once this function returns something that is not undefined, or not null, then it means it's okay. And just remember this thing and never look again for this binding. So for text, this is perfect, right? It's never going to change. Well, that's the thing, right? Depending whether you use some formatting. So for simple text, yes, that's okay. So this is, as you can see, the languages that we're going to support. It's not all of them, but I already have the placeholder in there so that this will be a text that's going to the translator, so they already can support it. The login page, that was one thing that I'm currently working on, which is not yet on Angular, but it's the server side. But I already wanted to have the text, so I put it in here. But more commonly, it's going to look like this, right? So you're still going to have your Angular binding. So this is one of these bindings, as I said, where something in your code says there is a header text in your controller, as it's called in Angular. And these will still work as normal. This is just data that you trust from the server. This header text came in this case from the server, right? So because we asked the server to return something in a certain language, this is already going to be okay. But if we go here, for instance, to this part where we show the account summary, and remember that I did a check for that to see if that's actually showing up, we have the normal text, and everybody can read account summary, right? No weird cryptic thing, right? And then I use an ID, and the ID is based on what I know of the application, how I understand it. So whenever I look at the translation file, and later on maybe something is changing, right? Maybe we add or remove these calls, and it's going to say, hey, I cannot find on the home page the account summary header anymore. And you're like, okay, I know exactly where to look, right? Something changed there, right? So this is actually for me a pointer to find right in the application where it is. But then I also have this one, the F text, which means the formatted text. And as you can see, I use here, this is a Sugar JS replacement. So I can assign the date to this field, as you can see. And I combine this with Angular. So if you do it like this is the Angular code. Oops, sorry. Have to get used to the commands. So this is just normal Angular to get the value, and then around it I have my API call, because I found some cases, because in some languages things swap around, right? So you still need to have the placeholder. This is very difficult if it is HTML, especially if that HTML has a Angular binding in itself, so an Angular component, because it needs to be pre-compiled, because this text is not going to be pre-compiled, right? So think of that. That was one thing where I went like, oops, yeah, that's a problem. Yeah.
Is Moment playing into that? Moment.js?
No, I don't use moment in this application. And this sugar is what we use. As you can see, indeed, I have here still a hard-coded string for the date format. And as I said, we chose this for now because we know how it looks. I will need to spend more time on testing this, right? Seeing how that will be different on different languages, especially because we first want to support Chinese and you just have one character and things like that, and where we show that, right? And then I just wanted to show one more. And so as you could all see, these are all text and f text, and you see I use them in the two curly braces because remember, you can only use plain text there. It should be only plain text. So when I call this and I capture this call, I can also tell the translator this thing can only be plain text because otherwise it's not going to be working. And let's find, I'm just gonna use the Control F, the HTML one. That should be in here somewhere too. Let's look at the purple. Finding it. There is somewhere an HTML binding in here. Sorry, I need to look for it. Haven't looked at it for a while. Where did I do that? Oh, I think on the browse. Where's my HTML? Yeah, there we go. Okay. As you can see, I have here two. HTML unsafe, because I use also Kendo's UI's controls, and they don't understand the bind thing, but I can still, apparently this one does accept the HTML, because it's Kendo, it has a special thing. So in here I say, this is going to be HTML, but it's going to be not secret. Right, it's going to be, I need to check on the backend code to make sure that this is safe HTML. This is just normal HTML, and as you can see, it renders this, it looks as normal HTML because it just recognizes this is a string and then helps me to format it. But as you can see, I need to do also some little quirks like this to make sure that it works. So it's not perfect. What I would like to have here maybe is a reference to a template to make that easy. So yeah, I think that's the part of the templates.
My question. So,
yeah.
Do you consider to use the filter inside of the bootstrap.test? Are there any limitations? Because the filters will be available for.
Right, the filters, yeah. So the filters is very hard to give context to that, and the filters also have a bit of slower performance to run. So that's why I didn't go for that approach. But they use this in the Angular Translate project. That's where they also use indeed the filters to do the same trick. Yeah. So I didn't went for it because I found filters not to be so readable. I find this to be, at least for myself, easy to understand. Yeah.
Have you seen there is a plugin called Angular GetText? It is similar to Angular Translate, but it also supports directives. It also supports JavaScript, so you can do GetText call in pure JavaScript. It's also using PO format. It doesn't give you the possibility actually to do the screenshots because it doesn't make any calls.
Yep.
It has brand extensions that can extract from your source code all the text occurrences, and then it can compile the PO files into JavaScript, so you can include on JavaScript. So there's a good question, how do you handle it in multiple languages, etc.
Right, right.
It's maybe worth to look at it, has different trade-offs, obviously.
Sounds good, yeah, it's definitely near what I want, yeah. Yeah, it's a good one. I'll have a look at that, thanks. That's a good tip, yeah. So the Angular GetText, right? Cool.
So no, I'll be room till 9. So just that.
Okay, alright. Yeah. Then I'm going to quickly fly through the last parts of the presentation that I had, the slides. This will be quite quick actually. So there's still a few tricks that you need to know. So when you go back to the localization, one thing which we used was a technique using the pseudo localization. So we had text that looks a little bit different than normal, but you can still read it, right? And you can see that it is a little bit wider, so it's padded with some extra things, so you can test it in your application. And this would be our language that we also have as a drop-down selector. So another nice thing about this thing is that if you have not translated it, it will pop out right immediately, because you get very used to the squiggly things. and if it's not there, it immediately pops out. So you know if you accidentally forgot something, because that's very hard to test, right? So when you do your localization, when you want to actually put a certain language in, this is quite nice. So I use this as my coverage test to see if it actually is working. This one is very important, right? Because yes, you have it all implemented. That was the internationalization stuff, but then you really want to get it in a certain language. So you need to work with a translator and help them work. They usually charge per word, and the words, if you have once translated it, they don't count double as long as you have a translation memory. So some do. So be careful when you pick your translator to see if they actually support to have this memory, because otherwise you charge many times for the same thing, right? Especially if you do little incremental updates. That's definitely something that you want to check. One thing that we found a bit tricky and difficult was how do we actually interchange this, because they're very used to do it in Word, but we don't want to have Word, right? We don't want to go copy pasting all the time. So we've been looking around like what's out there, and it turns out there is this international standard, which is pretty much like HTML. As in, everybody has their own way of implementing it, unfortunately. But now, as of lately, there is XLive version 2.0, which is all the good parts from it. You can think of it as HTML5 almost. It kind of works everywhere, it's kind of smart, so this is the one we picked because it was very easy to use. It's just standard XML, and so from the output that we have, so when I let the tool run, and the output that it generates, the logs that it makes, it does that in JSON, and then we have a conversion tool that then converts it into the XLive file format, which we can send to the translators, and translators go like, oh my god, this is so nice, because what they actually do is translate it into XLive, right? They format whatever you give them into XLive, which then goes into their translation tools, if they're a good translator, which provides all these nice things to make the translation job super easy. They can even chop up text, and if you look into the XLive format, and that's why we picked it, it has already all the smarts. All the things that you want to do as a translator are in there. So if you support it, yeah, I think that should be good. So that's why we picked this one. Think also about your industry expertise, right? Are you using language that is hard to translate? Is your translator capable of translating that? We're in the finance industry, we have certain terms, so we want to make sure that they are correct. And also, when it comes back, it's not always correct, right? You still need to have almost like a second party to validate whether your text is actually correct, right? So this is one thing that we're now facing, because we have also other languages where maybe we don't have somebody readily available who can check it. So think about that, right? That could be tricky. And as we said before, the translators need to know what is happening, right? Where is it going on the screen? Some translators provide that once you have uploaded it, you can have their translators do the proofreading, but the proofreading in the application. So you can give them access to your application, they see it, they mark it up, that's part of the package, right? So you can have around the fixed fee, so you know what is to be expected. But then, once you're done, that's not it, right? Whenever you make a change, and I know in our company, my bosses were not very happy to hear that, because we were very agile before, and they go like, oh wait, now we need to wait for the translator to come back before we can release things, right? We were very used to have a very quick cycle. So do think of that. That's actually quite a big impact if you have it. And if your upload process takes like several days because you don't have an automated tool to do it, well, the boss is not going to be happy. So the final notes, in essence, I found it to be relatively doable. It's getting better. There's the design document. I really recommend you to check that out. It's looking very promising. I hope it's getting better, and I hope you got something out of this. So thank you very much. I don't think we have time for questions, but find me on Twitter or get in touch with me later.
Maybe time for one question if anyone has any burning questions.
Who has the burning question?
We can chat over the meetup, or obviously ping Bart directly. So.
No problem. I would like to find out other people who are also doing this translation stuff, because I'm also just figuring this stuff out. So I hope you learned something. Cool.
Awesome. Thanks again, man. All right. Cool. Thanks everyone. So, yeah, we'll see you next time.